poor journalist eats a sandwich at the interview. The billionaire hired her for a secret reason. Before we begin the story, tell us in the comments, what is the most unconventional thing you've ever seen happen in a job interview? And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy. Theodore Sterling believed that a company, much like a human heart, was a liability if not properly managed. He was the CEO of the Sterling Chronicle, a century-old media empire he had inherited and was desperately trying to drag into the 21st century. His method was brutal but simple. Excise all sentimentality, fire anyone who spoke of journalistic integrity as if it were a viable business model, and replace every story with cold, hard, clickable data. The Chronicle was no longer in the business of telling stories. It was in the business of optimizing engagement metrics. This ruthless efficiency had earned him a reputation as the Ice King of New York media, a man who saw reporters as content-generating units and emotions as rounding errors. It was also why he was on his 5th executive assistant in as many months. They all quit, citing a work environment with the emotional warmth of a walk-in freezer. Which brought him to today. He was interviewing a new batch of candidates, each one more polished and perfect than the last. He sat at the head of a vast, intimidating conference table, his face a mask of bored impatience as another candidate droned on about her synergy-focused workflow. Meanwhile, in the waiting area, Isabel "Izzy" Rossi was having a crisis. Not an existential crisis, but a far more urgent, biological one. She was starving. She had been waiting for 3 hours. Her interview was scheduled for 10 a.m., It was now 1 p.m. She had missed the freelance shift she was supposed to work, and the single granola bar she'd had for breakfast had been vaporized by her nervous energy hours ago. Tucked inside her worn leather satchel was her emergency sandwich, a glorious, messy creation of salami, provolone, and an aggressive amount of olive tapenade on a crusty baguette. "Just one bite," she whispered to herself, her stomach rumbling a protest so loud she was sure they could hear it in the boardroom. "No one will notice." She unwrapped the sandwich. The glorious scent of garlic and olives filled her small corner of the waiting room. She took one magnificent, unapologetic bite. "Isabel Rossi?" A clipped voice called from the doorway. Izzy froze mid-chew, a piece of salami hanging precariously from her lips. She looked up to see a stern-looking woman in a severe gray suit. Izzy swallowed the bite whole, a move she immediately regretted, and jumped to her feet, trying to shove the rest of the sandwich back into her bag, while simultaneously wiping a stray olive from her chin. "That's me," she managed to say, her voice slightly muffled. "Ready when you are." She walked into the conference room, her cheeks burning, convinced her career had just ended before it even began. And there he was, Theodore Sterling. He was even more intimidating in person, with sharp, intelligent eyes, a perfectly tailored suit, and an aura of such intense control that she felt her own chaotic energy should apologize for existing in the same room. He gestured to the chair opposite him, his eyes flicking down for a fraction of a second to the small, telltale grease stain on her blouse. Izzy wanted the floor to swallow her whole. "Ms. Rossi," he began, his voice as cold and smooth as the marble table between them. "Your resume is unconventional. You have a degree in journalism from NYU, but your recent work experience seems to consist of freelance articles for websites with names like Quirky Histories and the Urban Explorer's Guide to Forgotten Pizza Joints. I believe in finding the story where no one else is looking, Mr. Sterling," Izzy said, finding a sliver of her usual confidence. "I see," he said, his tone suggesting he did not, in fact, see. "And what story, precisely, do you see here at the Sterling Chronicle?" Izzy took a deep breath. She had prepared for this. She had researched the company, analyzed its shift to data-driven content, and had a whole speech ready about integrating narrative storytelling with analytics. But as she looked at the cold, bored man in front of her, she knew the rehearsed answer was wrong. He didn't want a sycophant. He wanted a data point. So, she gave him one. "Honestly," she said, leaning forward slightly, "from what I've observed in your waiting room for the past 3 hours, the story I see is one of a company with a serious morale problem." Theodore's eyebrows shot up. This was not the answer he was expecting. The other candidates, Izzy continued, the words tumbling out now that she had committed to her path of brutal honesty. They're all polished, perfect, and terrified. They've been sitting out there rereading their resumes and practicing their power poses. The atmosphere is less dynamic media empire and more waiting for a root canal. Your employees look equally stressed. The receptionist sighed 6 times in the last hour. I counted, and your coffee machine makes a sound like a dying robot, which is probably a metaphor for something. She paused, realizing she was on a roll and probably careening towards unemployment. And then, there's me. You made me wait for 3 hours with no update. You have a system that is clearly inefficient and shows a lack of respect for people's time. So the story I see is of a company that's so focused on the data on the screen that it's forgotten about the humans in the chairs. And that, she finished, her heart pounding, is always a story that ends in collapse. The silence that followed was absolute. Izzy was sure he was going to have her thrown out. He just stared at her, his expression completely unreadable. He picked up her resume, looked at it, then back at her. You ate a sandwich during your interview, he stated, the words flat and devoid of judgment. I was hungry, she replied with a shrug, and my grandmother always said that a hungry brain makes for bad decisions. I wanted to be sharp for you. For the first time, a flicker of something that might have been amusement appeared in his cold gray eyes. So, your solution to saving my company is to, what? Install a better coffee machine and provide snacks? It's a start, she shot back. But the real solution is to remember what made the Chronicle great in the first place. You told stories. You found the human element in the driest of subjects. You're trying to win a game of numbers, Mr. Sterling, but you've forgotten that people don't connect with data. They connect with stories. He was quiet for a long, unnerving minute. Izzy prepared herself for the inevitable. Thank you for your time. We'll be in touch. Instead, he did something that completely shocked her. He pushed a button on his intercom. Helen, he said to his current, soon-to-be ex-assistant, cancel my remaining interviews for the day and send Ms. Rossi an offer of employment. Izzy's jaw dropped. Wait, what? You're hiring me? After I insulted your company, your employees, and your coffee machine? Precisely, he said, standing up, the interview clearly over. Because you are the first person who has walked into this room all day who didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. You told me the truth. He looked at the grease stain on her blouse, then met her eyes. Your methods are chaotic. Your resume is a disaster, and your lack of professional decorum is appalling. He paused. You start Monday at 9 a.m. Don't be late, and for God's sake, eat breakfast before you come. He turned and walked back to his inner office, leaving Izzy sitting alone in the vast conference room, a half-eaten sandwich in her bag, and the most important job of her life in her grasp. She wasn't sure if he had hired her because he saw her potential, or if he was so intrigued by her chaos that he wanted to study it up close. Either way, she had a feeling that life at the Sterling Chronicle was about to get a whole lot more interesting. Izzy's first day felt like being the only brightly colored parrot in a flock of pigeons. She arrived true to form with a box of donuts for the administrative staff and a small, resilient-looking plant for her desk, which she promptly named Herbert. The other assistants, a collection of quiet, impeccably dressed women who moved with a hushed reverence, stared at her as if she were a new and possibly dangerous species. This is your workspace. Theodore's outgoing assistant, a woman who looked like she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, explained. Mr. Sterling's schedule is on the shared calendar. He prefers all communication to be via email, unless the building is on fire. And even then, a concise subject line is appreciated. Izzy looked at the sterile desk, the gray computer, the muted gray walls. Got it, she said cheerfully. First order of business, we need more color in here. And snacks, definitely more snacks. Theodore, from his glass-walled office, watched her. He had hired her for a secret reason, a reason he wouldn't even admit to himself. He had hired her as an experiment. He wanted to see if her chaos could break through the rigid, suffocating order he had built. He wanted to see if she was right, if there was still a story to be found in the soul of his company. Her first week was a series of small, delightful acts of rebellion. She replaced the generic corporate hold music with a playlist of upbeat 70s funk. She started a good news bulletin board in the break room, where she posted positive stories about employees. She discovered that the notoriously grumpy head of the legal department was an avid bird watcher and won him over by leaving a detailed report on the migratory patterns of the local sparrow population on his desk. She was also, to Theodore's quiet astonishment, an exceptional assistant. She was organized in her own chaotic way. She had an almost psychic ability to know what he needed before he asked for it. And her writing skills were phenomenal. She could take his cold, data-heavy memos and transform them into clear, compelling narratives that people actually wanted to read. The real test came at the end of the second week. A major advertiser was threatening to pull their multi-million-dollar account, citing the Chronicle's lack of soul. Theodore had scheduled a last-ditch meeting to try and save the deal. He and his top executives had prepared a 50-page slide deck filled with engagement metrics and ROI projections. "This is boring," Izzy said, after he'd asked her to proofread it. She was perched on the edge of his desk, a red pen in her hand. "It's not supposed to be entertaining, Miss Rossi," he said stiffly. "It's supposed to be persuasive." "It's not persuasive if the client falls asleep before the third slide," she countered. "You're selling them data. You should be selling them a dream. What's the story here?" "The story is that advertising with us will increase their market share by 12%. Izzy sighed dramatically. "That's not a story. That's a math problem." She grabbed a blank piece of paper. "What does this client sell? Luxury watches?" "Who buys luxury watches? People who want to buy a piece of history, of legacy. So that's the story we tell." She spent the next hour with him, not creating a new presentation, but finding the story within the data. She found anecdotes about the magazine's history, testimonials from longtime readers, stories of how the Chronicle had been a part of the city's fabric for a century. Theodore was skeptical, but he was also desperate. He let her rewrite the presentation. The next day, in the meeting, he pushed aside the slide deck. He just talked. He told the story of his grandfather founding the magazine. He told the story of how their clients' watches were a symbol of moments that mattered, the same kinds of moments the Chronicle had been documenting for 100 years. He used the narrative Izzy had helped him craft. When he finished, the client, a notoriously tough CEO named Marcus Thorne, was silent for a long moment. "Nobody has ever talked about our brand that way," Marcus said finally, his voice full of a surprising emotion. "You're not just selling ad space, you're selling a partnership in our legacy." He extended his hand. "You've got the deal, Sterling, and I want a multi-year contract." After the clients left, Theodore stood in the empty conference room, a feeling of exhilaration coursing through him. He had won, and he had done it not with data, but with a story. He found Izzy at her desk, watering Herbert the plant. "You were right," he said, the admission costing his ego a considerable price. She looked up and smiled, a bright, knowing smile. "I usually am," she said. "Now, about that raise." He laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent and more genuine. As he walked back to his office, he knew that hiring Isabel Rossi was either the smartest or the craziest decision he had ever made. And for the first time in his life, he was excited to find out which it was. Izzy's victory with the Marcus Thorne account didn't just earn her a nod of approval from Theodore. It sent a seismic shockwave through the 50th floor of the Sterling Chronicle. Suddenly, the quirky sandwich girl wasn't just a curiosity, she was a force to be reckoned with. The other assistants started watching her, a mixture of envy and reluctant admiration in their eyes. Executives who had once ignored her now paused by her desk, asking for her unconventional take on their projects. Izzy handled her newfound status with her usual chaotic grace. She started an office snack club, insisting that good ideas were directly proportional to the quality of the available snacks. She organized a desk plant adoption day, where she gave away cuttings from Herbert the plant to other employees, each with a handwritten care manual that included instructions like, "Sing 80s power ballads to him on Wednesdays. He enjoys the drama." Theodore watched this cultural revolution from the glass-walled fortress of his office, feeling like a zoologist observing a new and fascinating species in its natural habitat. The data was undeniable. Since Izzy's arrival, interdepartmental communication had improved by 30% and employee-reported stress levels had dropped. The place was happier, more vibrant, and somehow more productive. It was illogical, it was infuriating, and it was working. Their own dynamic settled into a strange and compelling rhythm. He was the immovable object, she was the unstoppable force. Their daily interactions were a constant negotiation between his rigid order and her joyful chaos. "Miss Rossi?" he said into his intercom one morning, his voice tight with irritation. "Why is there a rubber chicken on my credenza?" "That's Bartholomew," Izzy's cheerful voice chirped back. "He's a stress chicken. When you feel the urge to fire someone for using the wrong font, you squeeze him instead. It's a win-win. He gets a hug, and someone gets to keep their job." Theodore stared at the bright yellow, vaguely smug-looking chicken. He was about to order her to remove it, but then he remembered the brutal conference call he had scheduled for 11 a.m. He quietly moved Bartholomew to a spot within easy reach of his desk chair. He found himself relying on her for more than just scheduling and memo writing. She had become his unofficial truth-teller, the one person in his entire empire who wasn't afraid to tell him he was wrong. "This new headline for the digital edition," he said, showing her a draft. "Market fluctuations indicate potential Q4 downturn. It's accurate and to the point." Izzy looked at it and shook her head. "It's also as exciting as watching paint dry. People don't want to read about downturns. They're living them. They want to know what it means for them." She scribbled on her notepad. "How about, is your job safe? What the shaky market means for you and your family. It's honest, it's direct, and it speaks to their fear." "It's fear-mongering," he countered. "It's empathy," she shot back. "There's a difference." He hated that she was right. They ran her headline. The article's engagement metrics tripled. But it was in the quiet moments that the real story between them was being written. He started noticing the small things. The way she would bite her lip when she was concentrating. The fact that she always had a spare granola bar in her bag, a holdover from her days of financial uncertainty. The way she talked about books, her face lighting up with a passion that was both intellectual and deeply personal. One evening, he was working late, and she was the only one left in the outer office. He walked out to find her not at her desk, but sitting on the floor, surrounded by a pile of old, leather-bound books. "What are you doing?" he asked, intrigued. "I found the key to the old archives," she said, her eyes shining. "This is the original collection of your great-grandfather, the one who started the paper. I'm trying to figure out who he was." "He was a ruthless businessman," Theodore said, repeating the family mantra. "No," she said, holding up a small, worn volume of poetry. "He was a romantic. He's got all of Keats's poems memorized. He's underlined his favorite passages." She looked up at him. "He was a man who loved stories, just like you." "I don't love stories," he said automatically. "I love data." "Do you?" she asked, her gaze direct and knowing. "Then why did you hire me?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. He didn't know why he had hired her, or rather, he did, but it was a reason he hadn't yet been able to articulate. He had hired her because she was the antithesis of everything his life had become. She was the story in his world of data. The catalyst for the next chapter of their story arrived in the formal invitation, embossed on thick, cream-colored cardstock. It was for the annual Sterling Media Gala, the most important event in the New York media calendar. It was also a notorious Shark Tank, a place where careers were made and destroyed over cocktails and canapés. "I need you to come with me," Theodore said, placing the invitation on her desk. "As my assistant, to take notes, to manage my schedule for the evening." Izzy looked at the invitation, then at him. "You mean, as your social arm," she said with a knowing smile. He didn't deny it. "The CEO of our biggest rival, a man named Julian Croft, will be there. We're in a bidding war for a new streaming service. The optics of this event are critical." "Got it," she said. "I'll be your wittiest, most charming human shield." The night of the gala, Izzy transformed. She wore a simple, floor-length black dress she'd found at a consignment shop, but she had tailored it herself, and it fit her perfectly. She looked elegant, sophisticated, and completely out of place, all at the same time. The event was as brutal as Theodore had predicted. Julian Croft, a man with a smile as slick as his hair, made a beeline for them the moment they walked in. "Sterling," Croft said, his eyes already sizing up Izzy. "I see you've brought some fresh perspective to your team. Izzy Rossi, my executive assistant, Theodore said, his tone clipped. A pleasure, Croft said, taking Izzy's hand and holding it a fraction of a second too long. It's always refreshing to see new talent. Tell me, Miss Rossi, what's it like working for a man who thinks journalism is a numbers game? Before Theodore could react, Izzy smiled sweetly. It's fascinating, Mr. Croft. It's like watching a master chess player. He's always thinking 3 moves ahead, whereas some people, she said, her gaze flicking to Croft's flashy watch, seemed to be more focused on the game board itself. Croft's smile tightened. He had been deftly and politely insulted. He quickly excused himself. Theodore looked down at her, a mixture of shock and admiration on his face. Did you just compare my biggest rival to a piece on a chessboard? I believe the term I used was the game board itself, she corrected. Much less flattering. He laughed, a rare, genuine sound in the sea of forced schmoozing. For the rest of the evening, they were a team. When a reporter tried to corner Theodore about declining ad revenues, Izzy smoothly interjected with a story about the Chronicle's new, highly successful community outreach program. When a powerful advertiser tried to bully him into a lower rate, she charmed the man's wife by discussing her passion for antique jewelry. She wasn't just his armor, she was his secret weapon. The pivotal moment came late in the evening. Theodore was in a tense, quiet negotiation with Marcus Thorne, the watch CEO, about a new exclusive partnership. They were in a private library off the main ballroom. The numbers are good, Sterling, Thorne was saying, but Croft is offering me a better deal, more exposure, a lower rate. His exposure is based on fleeting trends, Theodore argued. Our legacy is built on a century of trust. Legacy doesn't pay the bills, Thorne countered. At that moment, Izzy, who had been standing silently by the door, spoke up. Excuse me, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice quiet but clear. Both men turned to look at her. May I see the watch you're wearing? She asked. Thorne, surprised, held out his wrist. It was one of his company's most iconic models. Izzy didn't look at the watch face. She turned it over and looked at the back. This engraving, she said, her finger tracing the delicate script. It's a quote from Virgil. She then recited, in perfect, flawless Latin, a line from the Aeneid. Thorne was stunned. How in the world did you know that? My grandfather was a classics professor, she said with a simple shrug, and my first job was in a rare bookstore. I learned to recognize the stories behind the objects. She looked him in the eye. Your brand isn't about telling time, Mr. Thorne. It's about telling a story of legacy, of craftsmanship, of moments that last forever. That's a story Mr. Sterling and the Chronicle have been telling for 100 years. Mr. Croft's media group tells stories that are forgotten by the next morning. You have to decide which story you want your legacy to be a part of. She then stepped back, her job done. There was a long silence. Then Marcus Thorne slowly extended his hand to Theodore. You have a deal, Sterling, he said, and give your assistant a raise. She's worth every penny. On the drive home, the city lights a blur outside the car window. Theodore was quiet for a long time. How did you do it, Izzy? He asked finally. The Latin. The story. How did you know that would work? Because you were trying to sell him a product, she said, looking at him. But he wasn't buying a product. He was buying a piece of his own story. You just had to show him that you understood which story it was. He looked at her, at this incredible, brilliant, sandwich-eating woman who saw the world in a way he was only just beginning to comprehend. The secret reason he had hired her, the experiment to see if she could bring a soul back to his company, it was no longer an experiment. It was a fact. Izzy, he said, his voice suddenly raw. Yeah? I think I'm in trouble. What kind of trouble? She asked, a small smile playing on her lips. He looked at her, his carefully controlled world in a state of complete, beautiful freefall. The kind of trouble, he said, that I don't think I want to be saved from. The aftermath of the Sterling Media Gala was like the quiet, charged air after a lightning strike. The story of Theodore's new, brilliant assistant who could quote Latin and charm hostile clients spread through the New York media world like wildfire. Izzy Rossi was no longer the sandwich girl. She was a whispered legend. Sterling's secret weapon. For Izzy, the change was surreal. She went from being invisible to being intensely visible. People in the office who had once looked through her now stopped by her desk to chat, asking for her opinion on everything from headlines to lunch spots. She handled it all with her trademark humor, but a quiet part of her was unnerved by the attention. The most profound change, however, was in her relationship with Theodore. The professional line they had carefully tried to maintain was now hopelessly blurred. The air between them was thick with unspoken words and the memory of his confession in the car. They were orbiting each other, both terrified and thrilled by the gravitational pull. "We need a system," Theodore announced one morning, standing in front of her desk with a stack of files. He looked like a man trying to apply a mathematical formula to a hurricane. "A system for what?" Izzy asked, looking up from the report she was editing. "Our awkward, unspoken romantic tension?" He actually blushed, a faint color rising on his cheeks that she found ridiculously endearing. "No. For our work. We're a team now, a real one. We need a better way to collaborate." "You mean you want to schedule our spontaneous moments of genius?" she teased. "I mean," he said, a small smile playing on his lips, "that I want an excuse to spend more time with you without the entire office placing bets on when we'll finally admit we're dating." The word dating hung in the air, both a question and a statement. "Is that what we're doing?" Izzy asked, her voice softer now. "I hope so," he said, his gaze direct and sincere. "Are we?" She looked at him, at the man who was slowly, painstakingly dismantling the fortress around his own heart, and she felt her own defenses melt away. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think we are." And so began the secret, wonderful, and often hilarious courtship of Theodore Sterling and Isabel Rossi. Their dates were a perfect reflection of their two worlds colliding. He would take her to a 3-star Michelin restaurant, and she would spend the evening teaching him how to properly slurp his ridiculously expensive soup. She would take him to a chaotic, noisy flea market in Brooklyn, and he would spend the day analyzing the vendors' sales strategies and negotiating for a better price on a vintage typewriter. He was beginning to see the world through her eyes, a world filled with stories, with humor, and with a kind of simple, profound joy he had never known. She, in turn, was beginning to see the man behind the CEO, a man who was fiercely loyal, surprisingly funny, and had a deep, hidden well of kindness. But the world of high-stakes media does not allow for happiness to go unchallenged. While they were quietly falling in love, Julian Croft was plotting his revenge. Being outmaneuvered at the gala hadn't just cost him a deal, it had been a public humiliation. And Croft was not a man who forgave humiliation. He knew he couldn't attack Theodore on a purely financial front. Sterling was too smart, too established. So he decided to attack him where he was most vulnerable, his newfound story, his newfound soul. He decided to attack Izzy. The attack came in the form of a mole. Croft had a source inside the Sterling Chronicle, a disgruntled senior editor named Martin Wells, a man from the old guard who resented Izzy's sudden rise and the company's new sentimental direction. "I want everything you can find on her," Croft had told Wells in a clandestine meeting. "Her past, her friends, her family. I want a weakness. Find me a crack in her perfect, quirky facade." Wells, motivated by a mix of jealousy and a generous off-the-books payment from Croft, began to dig. He didn't find much. Izzy's life was genuinely simple: a small apartment, a history of freelance work, a close relationship with her grandmother. But then he found it, a small, almost insignificant detail in her old community college records. A single semester of medical leave, listed for family reasons. It was the crack Croft was looking for. The first article appeared on a Tuesday morning on a rival gossip blog that was secretly funded by Croft. The headline was explosive. "Who is Isabel Rossi? The troubled past of Sterling's new golden girl." The article was a masterpiece of malicious insinuation. It didn't make direct accusations, but it painted a dark, suggestive picture. It spoke of her mysterious departure from NYU, her unstable work history, and hinted at a hidden family tragedy that the Chronicle was trying to cover up. What is Theodore Sterling hiding about his new protégé? The article concluded. The story was designed to be poison. It was designed to turn Izzy's greatest strength, her authenticity, into a liability. It turned her compelling backstory into a suspicious one. The moment the article went live, the office was in an uproar. The whispers were back, but this time they were laced with a new, more sinister tone. Izzy found herself the subject of pitying looks and suspicious glances. She was in her office, staring at the article on her screen, feeling a cold dread creep into her stomach, when Theodore stormed in. His face was a mask of cold fury. "I'm going to destroy him," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm going to sue Croft and this pathetic blog into oblivion." "No," Izzy said, her voice surprisingly calm. He looked at her, stunned. "What do you mean, no? They are slandering you, they are attacking your character. And if you react with a lawsuit, you'll just confirm their narrative," she said, her strategic mind kicking in, even as her heart was breaking. "You'll look like a powerful billionaire trying to silence a story. It will make them look like they've hit a nerve. It will make me look guilty." "So, we do nothing?" he asked, incredulous. "We just let them print these lies?" "We don't do nothing," she said, standing up. "We do something smarter. We do what we do best. We tell a better story." He looked at her, seeing the familiar, defiant fire in her eyes, even though he could also see the hurt she was trying so hard to hide. "What's your plan, Rossi?" he asked, a glimmer of his old admiration returning. "Croft wants to play in the mud," she said with a grim smile. "Let's show him what happens when he picks a fight with someone who knows how to plant a garden in it." Their strategy session was intense. They gathered her small team from the qualitative analytics department, the only people in the building she knew she could trust completely. "They're attacking my past," Izzy said, pacing in front of a whiteboard. "So, we own my past. We don't hide from it. We turn it into our biggest strength." Her plan was bold and terrifyingly personal. She proposed that the Sterling Chronicle itself run a feature story, a long-form, deeply personal interview with her. She would tell her own story, in her own words. She would talk about her mother's illness, her decision to leave school, the struggles she faced. She would control the narrative by being radically, unapologetically honest. "It's too risky," one of her analysts said. "You'll be exposing your deepest vulnerabilities to the world." "Vulnerability isn't a weakness," Izzy said, her voice ringing with a conviction she had earned through years of hardship. "It's a superpower. People connect with scars, not with perfect facades." Theodore listened, his heart caught in a mix of fear for her and profound admiration for her courage. This was her battle, and she was choosing to fight it with the most powerful weapon she had, the truth. "I'll write the article myself," she declared, "and I'll interview the one person who knows the story best." She looked directly at Theodore. "You?" He was taken aback. "Me? You want me to interview you?" "Yes," she said. "The world sees you as the cold, calculating CEO. They see me as your mysterious project. Let's show them who we really are. A partnership. Two people who found in each other a strength they didn't know they had. Let's tell them our story." It was the riskiest PR move he had ever considered. It went against every rule of corporate damage control. It was raw, emotional, and completely unpredictable. "All right," he said, his decision made. "Let's tell them our story." The interview took place in the library of his penthouse. It wasn't a formal, televised event. It was just the two of them, a single camera, and a list of questions Izzy had written herself. He started with the easy questions about her childhood, her love for books, her passion for stories. Then he moved to the hard ones. "The article on that blog," he said, his voice gentle, "it mentioned a hidden family tragedy. Can you tell us about that?" Izzy took a deep breath, her gaze steady on the camera. "My mother," she began, "was the most brilliant, vibrant person I have ever known. She was a scientist, a botanist. She saw the world in a way no one else did, and she got sick. A rare, degenerative neurological disease. The medical bills were astronomical. I left school to take care of her. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a choice. A choice to honor the woman who gave me everything." She spoke for an hour, her voice never wavering. She told the truth, the whole, messy, painful, beautiful truth. She didn't ask for pity. She didn't make excuses. She simply told her story with a quiet, powerful dignity. The final question was the one that mattered most. "Izzy," Theodore said, his own voice thick with emotion. "People are speculating about our relationship. They say I hired you for reasons that were not professional. They say you are using me. I think it's time we tell them the truth about that too." She looked at him, a small, genuine smile on her face. "The truth," she said, "is that Theodore Sterling hired me because I ate a sandwich at my interview and told him his coffee machine was a disgrace. and I fell in love with him because he was the first person in a very long time who wasn't afraid of my truth." She then looked directly into the camera, as if speaking to every person who had ever felt underestimated. "My story is not about a poor girl being saved by a rich man. It's about a strong woman who saved herself, and in the process, showed a very powerful man how to save himself too." The interview, which Izzy titled The Sterling Chronicle, A Story in Data and Donuts, was published as a special feature on the magazine's website the next morning. It wasn't just an article, it was a multimedia experience. It included clips from their raw, unedited conversation, photographs from Izzy's childhood, and even scanned pages from her mother's scientific journals. It was a masterclass in narrative journalism, and it hit the New York media landscape with the force of a hurricane. By noon, it was the most read story in the country. The response was not just positive, it was a tidal wave of overwhelming support. "Tell Your Story, Izzy" trended on social media. Comments poured in, not just from regular readers, but from journalists, academics, and even a few celebrities. They didn't just praise Izzy's courage, they celebrated the Chronicle's radical act of transparency. "In an era of fake news and corporate spin," wrote a prominent media critic for the New York Times, "the Sterling Chronicle has done the unthinkable. It has told the truth. And in doing so, it has become the most relevant and important voice in American journalism today." The narrative had been completely flipped. Julian Croft's attempt to paint Izzy as a troubled, unstable opportunist had backfired spectacularly. He had tried to use her past as a weapon against her, and she, with Theodore's help, had transformed it into a shield, a symbol of resilience and authenticity that was more powerful than any lie he could spin. In his own sterile office, Julian Croft watched the fallout with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He had lost. He hadn't just failed to damage Sterling's reputation, he had inadvertently made it stronger. He had turned Izzy Rossi from a target into a national hero. At the Sterling Chronicle, the atmosphere was electric. The office, which had been thick with tension and whispers, was now buzzing with a new, unified sense of purpose. Employees looked at Izzy with a new level of respect, not just as a competent assistant, but as the moral compass of the entire organization. They looked at Theodore not as the Ice King, but as a leader who was willing to risk everything for the truth and for his people. The real victory, however, was quiet and personal. That evening, Theodore and Izzy were in his penthouse, not as a boss and an assistant, but as two partners who had just won a major battle together. They were sitting on the floor of his vast, minimalist living room, eating pizza out of a cardboard box, a small act of chaotic rebellion in his perfectly ordered world. "You were incredible," he said, watching her as she picked the olives off her slice with a look of intense concentration. "You weren't afraid. Not for a second." "Of course I was afraid," she said, popping an olive into her mouth. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway." She looked at him, her expression serious. "The question is, what about you? You risked everything. Your reputation, the company, your relationship with your board. Why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the glittering skyline of the city he had once thought he ruled. "Because for the first time," he said, his voice full of a new, quiet certainty, "I knew what I was fighting for. It wasn't about market share or engagement metrics. It was about you. It was about the truth. It was about building a company that I could actually be proud of." He turned to look at her, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. "You asked me once why I hired you. The real reason. I think I hired you because a part of me was starving too, not for food, but for something real, for a story that mattered. And I think, somewhere deep down, I knew that you were the only one who could help me find it." She looked at him, her heart full. The unspoken feelings that had been simmering between them for months finally rose to the surface, clear and undeniable. This was no longer just a partnership or a deep respect. It was love. "So," she said softly, a playful smile returning to her face, "now that we've saved the company and redefined the future of journalism, what's next on your to-do list, Mr. Sterling?" He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a warm jolt through her. "Actually," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur, "I was thinking of something a bit more personal." He leaned in, and this time, There were no interruptions, no corporate crises, no ghosts from the past to get in their way. It was just Theodore and Izzy, two story hunters who had finally found their own story. And as he kissed her with the taste of pizza and victory on their lips, they both knew it was a story that was just getting started. Their relationship, once it was finally out in the open, was a beautiful, chaotic thing. It was a whirlwind of late-night talks, of shared dreams, of two worlds colliding in the most wonderful way. He introduced her to the world of fine art and classical music. She introduced him to the joy of second-hand bookstores and cheap, delicious street food. He was her anchor of calm stability. She was his constant, joyful reminder to embrace the messiness of life. The company continued to thrive under their joint, unofficial leadership. The Izzy effect was real. She had a unique talent for seeing the human story in everything, and that perspective proved to be not just good for morale, but incredibly good for business. She launched a new section of the Chronicle called The Unseen City, a series of deep-dive articles that told the stories of the city's unsung heroes, the night shift nurses, the subway conductors, the community organizers. It became the most popular section of the magazine, winning awards and attracting a new, loyal readership. But their newfound happiness was not without its challenges. The biggest challenge was a quiet, unresolved issue that lingered between them. Izzy's past. She had told the world her story, but she had never told Theodore the full, unedited version of what had happened with her mother's illness, the real reason she had to leave her academic dreams behind. The opportunity came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. They were at her grandmother's small, cozy apartment, helping her sort through old photo albums. "This was your mother," her grandmother said, her voice thick with love as she pointed to a picture of a young, vibrant woman with Izzy's same bright, intelligent eyes. "She was so proud of you. She knew you were destined for great things." Later, after her grandmother had gone for a nap, Izzy and Theodore were sitting on the small balcony, a comfortable silence between them. "There's more to the story," Izzy said suddenly, her voice quiet. "About my mother." He turned to her, his full attention on her. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to." "I want to," she said. "I need to." She took a deep breath. "My mother didn't just get sick," she began. "Her illness was a direct result of a clinical trial for a new drug she had participated in. A drug developed by a subsidiary of a major pharmaceutical company." Theodore listened, his heart starting to beat a little faster, a cold sense of dread creeping in. "The trial was a disaster," Izzy continued, her voice trembling slightly. "There were side effects they didn't disclose. My mother, and dozens of others, were left with permanent, degenerative damage. We tried to fight it, we tried to sue, but they had the best lawyers in the country. They buried us in paperwork, they delayed, they denied. They had a key piece of evidence, an internal memo that proved they knew about the risks, but it disappeared from the records. We lost everything trying to fight them, my family's savings, my college fund, everything. That's why I had to drop out. That's why I was so desperate." She finally looked at him, her eyes full of a pain that was years old. "The company that did this, the company that destroyed my mother's health and my family's future, it was a subsidiary of Croft Media." The name landed in the room like a stone. Julian Croft, his rival, the man who had tried to destroy her. It wasn't just a professional rivalry, it was a deep, personal, and unforgivable wound. Theodore was speechless. He finally understood the depth of the battle she had been fighting her whole life. It wasn't just a battle against poverty, it was a battle for justice. "Izzy," he said, his voice raw with emotion, "why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to fight my battles for me," she said fiercely. "This is my story, my fight, and I was going to win it on my own." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "I was using my position at the Chronicle to dig, to find the proof I needed, to find that lost memo. That was my secret reason all along." He stared at her, a new, profound level of understanding dawning on him. He hadn't just hired a chaotic, brilliant assistant. He had hired a warrior, a quiet, relentless crusader for justice. "You're not on your own anymore," he said, his voice a firm, unbreakable promise. He took her hand, his grip solid and reassuring. "This isn't just your fight now, it's ours. And Julian Croft has no idea what's about to hit him." The revelation of Izzy's past didn't just add a new layer to their relationship. It fused them together, turning their love story into a quest for justice. The Sterling Chronicle, once a bastion of data-driven, emotionless reporting, was about to become the headquarters for the most personal investigation of Theodore's career. His secret reason for hiring her, to see if she could bring a soul back to his company, had led to a mission he never could have predicted. Using that soul to right a terrible wrong. "We have to be smart about this," Theodore said the next morning. They were in his penthouse, a makeshift war room now, with documents and old legal files spread across the polished dining table. Herbert the plant stood sentinel on a nearby counter, wearing a tiny, hand-knitted detective's trench coat Izzy had made for him. "Croft is a snake. He's covered his tracks. A direct accusation without irrefutable proof will just look like sour grapes. A personal vendetta." "I know," Izzy said, her mind already racing. "We don't go after him directly. We go after the story, the one he buried." Their plan was a brilliant fusion of their two skill sets. Theodore, with his understanding of corporate structures and financial trails, would handle the how. He would use his resources to discreetly track the money, the shell corporations, the network of subsidiaries that Croft Media used to hide its darkest secrets. Izzy, with her storyteller's heart and her investigative journalist's instincts, would handle the who and the why. She would find the other victims. For the next few weeks, they lived and breathed the investigation. Their days were spent running the Chronicle, their nights spent hunched over laptops, piecing together a puzzle that was a decade old. It was an exhausting, all-consuming task, but it forged their partnership in a way that quiet dinners and romantic walks never could. They were soldiers in the same trench, fighting for the same cause. Izzy began her hunt in the digital catacombs of the internet. She scoured old medical forums, support groups for patients with rare diseases, and archived news articles from the time of the clinical trial. Slowly, carefully, she began to find them. The other names, the other victims. A retired school teacher in Ohio who now lived with chronic pain. A young father in Florida who had lost his ability to work. A woman in California who had lost her own mother to the same degenerative condition that had afflicted Izzy's. She didn't approach them as a reporter from a powerful media empire. She approached them as one of their own. She sent them quiet, personal emails, not asking for an interview, but sharing her own story. "My mother was part of the Ethelred trial too," she would write. "I know the pain and the silence that followed. If you are ever ready to talk, I am here to listen." The responses at first were hesitant. These were people who had been broken, silenced, and taught that their stories didn't matter. But Izzy's empathy was a key that unlocked doors that had been rusted shut for years. One by one, they began to talk. They shared their stories of loss, of medical debt, of a justice system that had failed them. Izzy listened, not as a journalist chasing a scoop, but as a daughter. As a fellow traveler on a long, painful road. She was gathering not just facts, but a chorus of human pain. Meanwhile, Theodore was navigating a different kind of jungle. He used a team of his most trusted financial forensic accountants, working under the cover of a routine internal audit, to follow the money trail. He traced the funding for the disastrous clinical trial back to a subsidiary of a subsidiary, a shell corporation registered in a country with famously lax regulations. And he found something that made his blood run cold. "It's worse than we thought," he told Izzy late one night, his face grim in the glow of his computer screen. "The Ethelred drug, it wasn't just a failure. They knew it had a high probability of causing the exact neurological damage your mother and the others suffered. They buried the preliminary data." "But the memo," Izzy said, her voice tight, "the one we could never find. The proof." "That's the problem," Theodore said, running a hand through his hair. "It's not in any of their digital archives. It's like it never existed. Without it, it's just their word against the words of a group of victims they can easily paint as disgruntled and looking for a payday. It was their missing piece. The one thing that could turn their collection of tragic stories into an unshakable case." The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. Izzy was on a late-night call with the son of one of the victims, a man who had been a teenager when his father got sick. "I remember my dad was so angry," the man said. He kept talking about a Dr. Alistair. Alistair? Izzy repeated, writing the name down. He never mentioned that name in his official testimony. No, he was afraid, the man said. Dr. Alistair was one of the lead researchers on the trial. A young, idealistic guy. My dad said he was the only one who seemed to have a conscience. He resigned right after the trial was shut down, said he couldn't be a part of it. It was a long shot, a ghost from a decade ago. But it was the only lead they had. For the next week, Theodore used every resource at his disposal to find Dr. Alistair. There was no one by that name in any current medical registry. It was as if he, too, had vanished. Finally, using a deep background search, they found him. He had changed his name. He was now Dr. Miles Finch, a small-town doctor in a quiet corner of Vermont, a man who had clearly tried to leave his past behind. "This is it," Izzy said, looking at the address on the screen. "He's the one who knows where the bodies are buried." "I'll book us a flight," Theodore said. "No," Izzy said, putting her hand on his arm. "Not us. Me. I have to do this alone." He looked at her, ready to argue, to insist on protecting her. But he saw the look in her eyes. This wasn't about the company. This wasn't about their relationship. This was about a daughter's promise to her mother. "Okay," he said, his voice full of a trust that was now absolute. "Go get the story. I'll be here, holding down the fort." Izzy found Dr. Finch in a small, cozy clinic that smelled of antiseptic and wood smoke. He was an older man now, with kind, sad eyes and a gentle demeanor. When she introduced herself and told him why she was there, he looked like a man who had been expecting this visit for 10 years. "I knew this day would come," he said, his voice heavy with a decade of guilt. He led her to his small, book-lined office and told her everything. He told her about the pressure from Croft Media's executives to push the drug through trials, despite the worrying preliminary data. He told her about the secret memo, a document he himself had co-authored, detailing the potential for severe neurological side effects. He told her how, when he had threatened to go public, he had been intimidated, threatened with the ruin of his career, and forced to sign a draconian non-disclosure agreement. "I was a coward," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I chose my career over my conscience. I've lived with that every day for the past 10 years. "It's not too late to do the right thing," Izzy said gently. "They'll destroy me," he said. "The NDA. An NDA that was signed under duress to cover up a crime is not a legally binding document," Izzy countered, her journalistic and legal instincts kicking in. "It's a tool of intimidation, and they are counting on your silence." She looked him in the eye. "I know what it's like to be afraid," she said. "But I also know what it's like to fight for the truth. You are not alone in this. We will protect you." He was quiet for a long, long time, the weight of a decade of silence pressing down on him. Then he slowly walked over to a locked filing cabinet in the corner of his office. He turned a key, opened a drawer, and pulled out a single thin file. "I made a copy," he whispered, his hands trembling as he handed it to her. "Of everything. The memo, the original data. I've kept it all these years, hoping one day I would have the courage to use it." He looked at her, his eyes full of a new, fragile hope. "I think," he said, "that day is today." Izzy took the file. It was the key, the irrefutable proof, the weapon that would finally bring Julian Croft to justice. As she walked out of the clinic and into the crisp Vermont air, she felt the weight of her mother's memory on her shoulders. But it was not a heavy weight. It was a guiding one. She had the story, and now she was going to write the ending. Izzy flew back from Vermont not with the nervous energy of a journalist chasing a story, but with the cold, focused calm of a general on the eve of a decisive battle. The file Dr. Finch had given her felt heavier than any luggage, each page a testament to a decade of corporate malfeasance and a promise of long-overdue justice. She didn't call Theodore from the airport. She knew this next step was hers, and hers alone, to take. She spent the next 48 hours locked in her apartment, which she had transformed into a journalistic command center. She didn't just write an article. She built a case. She cross-referenced the names in Dr. Finch's memo with the stories she had gathered from the other victims. She created a timeline, a devastatingly clear and linear account of the entire Ethelred scandal, from the first suppressed data points to the final, heartbreaking outcomes for the patients. She wrote with a clarity and a fury that was bone deep. This was not just a story for her, it was her mother's story. It was the story of every family that had been broken by Croft's greed. She wrote not just about the data, but about the human cost. She wrote about the school teacher in Ohio who could no longer hold a book. She wrote about the young father in Florida who would never be able to teach his son how to throw a baseball. She wrote with a raw, powerful empathy that transformed the piece from a corporate exposé into a human tragedy. When she was finished, she didn't send it to the news desk. She walked into Theodore's office, placed the finished manuscript on his desk, and said 2 words. Front page. Theodore read the entire 10,000-word piece in a single, unbroken silence. When he looked up, his eyes were full of a quiet, profound awe. "Izzy," he said, his voice hoarse, This is the most important piece of journalism this magazine will ever publish." "I know," she said simply. "Are you ready for what comes next?" he asked, his expression serious. "When this goes live, it's not just going to be a story, it's going to be a war. Croft will come after you, after me, after this company, with everything he has." "Let him," Izzy said, a fire in her eyes that could have forged steel. "I've been ready for this war for 10 years. The story, titled The Ethelred Betrayal, How Croft Media Sacrificed Lives for Profit, was published on a Thursday morning. It wasn't just published, it was unleashed. It went live simultaneously on the Sterling Chronicle's website in a special digital edition and was hand-delivered to every major news outlet, regulatory agency, and congressional office in the country. The impact was instantaneous and apocalyptic. By 10 a.m., Croft Media's stock had been halted on the New York Stock Exchange after plummeting 60%. By noon, the district attorney's office had announced a full-scale criminal investigation. By 3 p.m., a congressional committee had scheduled an emergency hearing. The story was the lead on every news channel in the world. Julian Croft's carefully constructed empire began to crumble in a matter of hours. His board of directors called an emergency meeting. His investors panicked. His powerful political allies, who had once been on his payroll, were now scrambling to distance themselves from him. From her small, quiet office at the Chronicle, Izzy watched it all unfold, not with a sense of triumphant glee, but with a quiet, somber satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. The call she had been waiting for came late that afternoon. It was from Julian Croft himself. "You," he snarled, his voice a venomous whisper. "You have no idea what you've just done." "I think I do, Mr. Croft," Izzy replied, her own voice calm and steady. "I've told the truth, a concept you might find unfamiliar. I will destroy you," he hissed. "You and Sterling and that pathetic little magazine. I will bury you in lawsuits. I will ruin you." "You can't ruin someone who has already lost everything and rebuilt herself," Izzy said, her voice unwavering. "You have no power over me anymore. The story is out. And it's not just my story now. It's the story of every person you harmed, and their voices are a lot louder than your threats." She hung up the phone before he could reply, a quiet, final click that ended a decade of silence. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Izzy became the face of the Ethelred scandal, a reluctant hero thrust into the national spotlight. She was praised for her courage, her tenacity, her brilliant, compassionate journalism. She was invited to speak on news programs, to testify before Congress, to tell her story. Through it all, Theodore was her anchor. He was not just her boss or her lover, he was her partner. He handled the legal threats, managed the media frenzy, and stood by her side, a quiet, unshakable shield of support. He made sure the world saw her not as a victim, but as the powerful, intelligent woman she was. Their own relationship, forged in the crucible of this shared battle, deepened into something solid and unbreakable. The last of their own walls had come down. There were no more secrets, no more hesitations. They were a unit, a team, facing the world together. The final act of the drama took place a month later, in a sterile congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C. Julian Croft, looking haggard and defeated, was testifying under oath. Izzy was in the audience, sitting in the front row, a silent, powerful presence. Croft lied, denied, and deflected. But the evidence was overwhelming. The memo, the victim testimonies, the financial trail, it was an airtight case. The hearing was a public crucifixion, the final, humiliating end to his reign of power. After the hearing, As Izzy was leaving the building, surrounded by a swarm of reporters, she saw a familiar figure standing by a black town car. It was Theodore. He wasn't waiting in the car. He was standing on the sidewalk, waiting for her. A silent, public declaration of his solidarity. She pushed through the reporters and walked over to him. He didn't say anything. He just opened the car door for her. "Where to now, Miss Rossi?" he asked, a small, tired smile on his face. She looked at him, at the man who had risked his own empire to help her fight for her past, and she knew the answer with absolute certainty. "Home," she said, her voice full of a peace she had not known in a decade. "Let's go home." The drive back to New York was quiet, but it was a comfortable, contented silence. The war was over. The story had been told. Justice, in its slow, grinding way, was being served. When they walked into his penthouse, it felt different. It was no longer his cold, sterile fortress. It was their sanctuary. Izzy's touch was everywhere. The cheerful plant on the windowsill, the stack of books on the coffee table, the lingering scent of the lavender tea she liked. "It's finally over," she said, sinking into the comfortable sofa, the exhaustion of the past few months finally hitting her. "No," he said, sitting down beside her and taking her hand. "It's finally beginning." She looked at him, puzzled. "This whole time," he said, his voice low and serious, "we've been fighting your past. My past. Croft. Our own fears. Now we finally have a chance to think about our future." He squeezed her hand. "What do you want, Izzy? Now that you can have anything you want. Do you want to run the Chronicle? Do you want to start your own investigative unit? Do you want to write a book?" She was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I want to do all of that," she said, "but not yet." "And what do you want to do now?" She smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that lit up her whole face. "Now," she said, "I want to go to that little Italian restaurant in your neighborhood. I want to eat a ridiculous amount of handmade pasta, and I want to hold your hand in public without worrying that a reporter is going to take our picture." He laughed, a deep, joyful sound that filled the quiet room. "That," he said, "is the best business proposal I've heard all year." He leaned in and kissed her, a long, slow, peaceful kiss that wasn't about passion or desperation, but about the quiet, profound joy of a new beginning. They had faced the dragons of the past and won. And now they had a lifetime of quiet, ordinary, wonderful moments to look forward to. And they both knew that was the greatest story of all. Life after the storm was a strange and beautiful territory. For Izzy, the silence was the most profound change. For a decade, her life had been a constant, roaring battle, a fight for her mother's health, a fight for her own survival, a fight for justice. Now, in the quiet aftermath of Julian Croft's public downfall, the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with peace. The world wanted to turn her into a celebrity. She was inundated with offers. Book deals, movie rights, a lucrative contract as a special correspondent for a major news network. She turned them all down, much to the bewilderment of her newfound admirers. "Why?" Theodore had asked her, genuinely curious, as they sat on the floor of her old apartment, packing the last of her grandmother's books into boxes. She had decided to keep the apartment, not to live in, but as a small, quiet sanctuary, a reminder of where she came from. "Because I'm not a brand," she had replied, carefully wrapping a worn copy of 100 Years of Solitude in tissue paper. "I'm a journalist, and for the past 10 years I've only been able to tell one story. My own. Now I want to tell other people's stories, the ones that no one else is listening to." And so, she did. With Theodore's full blessing and the resources of the Sterling Chronicle at her disposal, she created a small, independent investigative unit within the magazine. It was a two-person department. Just her and a young, ferociously smart researcher she had hired. They didn't chase headlines or scandals. They pursued stories of quiet injustice. The case of a wrongfully convicted man in a small southern town, the story of a community whose water was being poisoned by a local factory, the plight of immigrant farm workers being exploited in California. She was brilliant at it. She had a unique ability to earn people's trust, to make them feel seen and heard. She would spend weeks on a single story, living in the communities she was covering, eating in their diners, listening to their fears in their own living rooms. Theodore watched, amazed, as she used her platform not for fame but for service. Their own love story, in the meantime, was a quiet, steady process of discovery. Having fought a war together, they now had to learn how to live in peacetime. They had to learn the small, intimate details of each other's lives. He learned that she was a terrible morning person, a grumpy, monosyllabic creature until she had her first cup of coffee. He learned that she had a secret, absurd love for terrible reality television, which she would watch with a kind of anthropological fascination. He learned that when she was truly happy, she would hum a specific off-key tune from an old Spanish folk song. She, in turn, learned that the Ice King of New York media was, in private, a man of simple comforts. She learned that he had a surprisingly goofy laugh, the kind that made his eyes crinkle at the corners, which was usually reserved for bad puns and slapstick comedies. She learned that he was a secret history buff, with an encyclopedic knowledge of the Roman Empire. And she learned that his greatest fear was not business failure, but thunderstorms, a holdover from a childhood memory of a particularly bad storm, the night his mother had gone into the hospital for the last time. One rainy Tuesday night, as a storm rattled the windows of the penthouse, she found him standing in the dark, staring out at the lightning, his posture rigid. She didn't say anything. She just came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and rested her head on his back. He flinched at first, a reflex from a lifetime of solitude. Then he relaxed into her embrace, leaning his weight against her. They stood like that for a long time, watching the storm together. And he realized that for the first time in his life, the sound of thunder didn't feel so lonely. Their biggest challenge was learning how to navigate their two vastly different worlds. One weekend, he took her to a stuffy, high-society wedding in the Hamptons. She had survived for exactly 1 hour before declaring that she was allergic to conversations about trust funds, and escaped to the beach, where he later found her, shoes off, happily talking to a group of local fishermen about the day's catch. The next weekend, she took him to her grandmother's neighborhood block party in Brooklyn. He, in his perfectly pressed casual clothes, looked like an undercover agent on a mission. He stood awkwardly, holding a paper plate of potato salad, until a group of Izzy's formidable aunts cornered him and subjected him to a 3-hour interrogation about his intentions, his politics, and his opinion on the proper way to season a roast chicken. He had survived, barely, and had even won them over by the end of the night with his quiet sincerity and his surprising knowledge of Roman military history, a topic they found inexplicably fascinating. "You know," he said on the drive home, looking exhausted but happy, "your aunts are more intimidating than the entire board of directors of Croft Media." "I know," she said with a grin. "That's why they're my family. They have a very rigorous vetting process." It was during one of these quiet domestic weekends that Theodore did something that solidified the final piece of their story. They were at a small, local nursery, a place Izzy loved, picking out plants for the penthouse terrace. "I want to make it feel less like a landing pad for a helicopter, and more like a garden," she had declared. As they were looking at a row of fragrant lavender plants, Theodore's phone buzzed. It was a text from his lawyer. "It's done. The papers are signed. Croft Media has been officially dissolved and its assets absorbed. The final chapter is closed." Theodore stared at the message, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. Julian Croft, his once great rival, was officially and completely finished, his empire dismantled, his name a footnote in the history of corporate disgrace. "What is it?" Izzy asked, sensing the shift in his mood. He showed her the text. "It's over," he said quietly. "The war is officially over." She expected him to look triumphant, or at least relieved, but instead he just looked thoughtful. "Let's buy this one," he said, pointing to a small, unassuming olive tree in a simple terracotta pot. "An olive tree?" she asked, surprised. "Yes," he said, "for peace." They took the tree home and planted it in the largest pot on the terrace, a quiet, symbolic act. That evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, he turned to her. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice serious. "One more loose end from the past." "What is it?" "My parents," he said. "My relationship with them. It was complicated. My father was a good man, but a hard one. He taught me about business, but he never taught me about happiness. And my mother, I was so young when she died. My memories of her are like faded photographs." "I know," Izzy said softly, taking his hand. No, you don't, he said, because I never told you the full story. The reason I'm so obsessed with the Chronicle's legacy, the reason your work, your passion for stories, means so much to me. He took a deep breath. My mother was a journalist. Before she married my father, she was one of the best investigative reporters in the country. She was fearless. She told the stories no one else would. He looked at Izzy, his eyes full of a new, profound understanding. When she married my father, she gave it all up. He asked her to. He said the wife of a Sterling shouldn't be chasing stories in dangerous places. He wanted her to be a society wife. And she did it. She chose him. But it broke her heart. I was too young to understand then, but I see it now. I see it in her old journals, the ones I was always too afraid to read until you came along. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. You, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You are the journalist she always wanted to be. You are living the life she gave up. When I'm with you, when I see you fighting for the truth, it's like I get a piece of her back. Izzy was speechless, tears streaming down her face. She finally understood the depth of the connection between them. It wasn't just a romance, it was a legacy. A story of 2 generations of strong, brilliant women, connected by a man who had finally learned to see their true worth. Theodore, she whispered. I love you, Isabel Rossi. He said, his voice a raw, honest whisper. And I think my mother would have loved you too. She didn't need to say anything. She just leaned in and kissed him. A kiss that was full of the past, the present, and the beautiful shared future that stretched out before them. The story wasn't just his or hers anymore, it was theirs. The wedding of Theodore Sterling and Isabel Rossi was not the society event of the year. It was something far rarer and more beautiful. A celebration of a story. They chose to get married in the place where their new life had truly begun, the grand, sunlit atrium of the New York Public Library. A cathedral of stories, a place where every book held a different world. The guest list was a testament to the life they had built together. Izzy's grandmother sat in the front row, holding court and discreetly passing out homemade cookies to the other guests. The families of the Ethelred victims, whose stories Izzy had brought to light, were there as honored guests. Dr. Miles Finch, the doctor from Vermont who had found his courage, sat beside them. The team from the Qualitative Analytics Department, now the most respected unit at the Chronicle, was there, cheering louder than anyone. Theodore's world was there too, but it was a different world now. The stuffy, judgmental board members were gone, replaced by a new, more diverse group of leaders who believed in his new vision. His few true friends, the ones who had stood by him during the storm, were there. And in a quiet corner, watching with a complex mixture of pride and regret, was his father, a man who was slowly, awkwardly, trying to learn the language of his son's new happiness. Izzy didn't wear a designer gown. She wore a simple, elegant dress the color of old parchment, hand-embroidered by a co-op of immigrant women she had helped fund through the new Sterling Rossi Foundation, the philanthropic arm they had created to continue her work. In her hands she carried not a bouquet of perfect roses, but a small, worn volume of Keats's poetry, the same one she had found in his great-grandfather's collection. Theodore waited for her at the front of the atrium, under a soaring archway of books. He looked at her as she walked towards him, not as a prize he had won or a problem he had solved, but with a look of pure, reverent love. He saw his partner, his equal, his entire world. They wrote their own vows, and they spoke them not to the crowd, but to each other. Theodore, Izzy began, her voice clear and strong. You came into my life as a headline I didn't want to read. You were the cold data, the hard fact, the story I thought I already knew. But you let me see the footnotes, the hidden chapters, the beautiful, messy, human story underneath. You taught me that even the most carefully edited life has room for a new draft. She smiled through her tears. I promise to be your co-author, your editor, and your most devoted reader. For all the chapters to come, I love you. When it was his turn, Theodore's voice was thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. Izzy, he said, his hands holding hers. My life was a perfectly preserved archive, a collection of facts without a narrative. You walked in, threw open the windows, and let the light in. You didn't just organize my past, you gave me a future. You are the story I was always meant to find. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. I promise to honor your story, to protect your voice, and to build a life with you that is more honest and more beautiful than any headline we could ever write. I love you." Their first kiss as husband and wife was a quiet, profound moment, a silent vow sealed in a cathedral of stories. The reception that followed was a perfect reflection of them. A joyful, chaotic, and incredibly loving affair. There was a jazz band playing in one corner and a salsa band in another. The food was a delicious mix of five-star cuisine and the best street food New York had to offer. Their first dance was not a choreographed waltz. It was a slightly clumsy, incredibly happy salsa, which Theodore had been secretly taking lessons for. He stumbled. He spun the wrong way, but he never stopped smiling, and Izzy laughed with a joy so pure it seemed to light up the entire room. Later that evening, they found a quiet moment on a balcony overlooking the city. "Happy, Mrs. Sterling Rossi?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her. "I'm keeping both names," she said with a grin. "It's a merger, not a takeover." He laughed, resting his chin on her head. "I wouldn't have it any other way." "You know," she said, looking out at the glittering skyline, "my mother always dreamed of this. Not the money or the fancy parties, but of seeing justice done, of knowing her story mattered." She turned in his arms to face him. "Thank you for helping me give her that." "You gave it to Izzy," he said softly. "You just let me be a part of the story." Their life together was not a fairy tale ending. It was a real, ongoing, beautiful beginning. The Sterling Rossi Foundation became a powerful force in the world of investigative journalism, funding the kinds of deep, time-consuming stories that no one else would. They told the stories of the forgotten, gave voice to the silenced, and held the powerful accountable. Izzy became one of the most respected journalists of her generation, not for her fame, but for her integrity. She never lost her connection to the world outside the boardroom, the world of tired mothers and hopeful dreamers. Theodore, in turn, transformed the Sterling Chronicle. It became a new kind of media empire, one built not just on profit, but on purpose. He proved to the world that you could be successful and have a soul, that you could tell important stories and still run a thriving business. They built a home together, a warm, book-filled apartment that was always full of laughter, the smell of good food, and the occasional, chaotic visit from Izzy's grandmother and her formidable aunts. About 2 years after their wedding, they were in the nursery they had built, a cozy room painted the color of a summer sky. Izzy was sitting in a rocking chair, humming a soft Spanish lullaby, while Theodore held their newborn daughter in his arms. She was tiny, perfect, with her mother's bright, curious eyes and a stubborn tuft of hair that refused to lie flat. "What should we call her?" Theodore whispered, his voice full of awe. Izzy looked at the small, precious child, the living, breathing symbol of their incredible journey. She thought of her own mother, the brilliant scientist. She thought of Theodore's mother, the fearless journalist. She thought of all the strong, resilient women whose stories had brought them to this moment. "Eleanor," she said softly. "Eleanor Grace." Theodore looked at her, his eyes shining with tears. "It's perfect," he said. He gently placed their daughter in Izzy's arms. He knelt down in front of them, his own small, perfect family. The story of his life, which had started as a cold, lonely monologue, had become a beautiful, sweeping epic, a love story for the ages. He was no longer the Ice King. He was just a husband, a father, a man who had been lucky enough to find the one story that truly mattered. And he knew, with a certainty that was as solid and as real as the tiny hand wrapped around his finger, that this was the only headline he would ever need. We'd like to take a moment to say a special thank you and welcome to some of our newest subscribers. Your support means the world to us and allows us to keep telling these narratives. A huge warm welcome to Robert E. Matson, me Pat, EJ295, and Miss Kingbilly. We are so grateful to have you as part of our community. What did you think of the story of Theodore and Izzy? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate their journey for justice and love? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And for everyone who stayed with us until the very end, who believes that telling the truth is the most powerful love story of all, please comment with the word legacy. We love knowing you are with us. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more narratives that will inspire your heart.